Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, venturing out of your homes in this lovely weather. Thanks for joining us as we continue our Fall Meet the Author series here at Darien Library. I'd like to mention that programs here are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign, so thank you so much for your continued support to make programs like this evening's available to the community. Tonight's guest is a correspondent for The Atlantic, Science, and Wired, and has written for Fortune, The New York Times, Smithsonian, Technology Review, Vanity Fair, and The Washington Post, as well as for HBO and Law & Order. A three-time National Magazine Award finalist, he is the recipient of writing awards from the American Bar Association, the American Institute of Physics, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and the Lenin Foundation. His book, 1491, won the National Academy's Communication Award for Best Book of the Year. And when I went to Peru a few summers ago, 1491 was actually the only book I brought with me. His book, 1493, is a new history of how European settlements in the post-Columbian eras shaped the world. And I'd also like to mention that I learned things in this book that I never learned in school, and I took AP US History and American Studies in college. Presenting the latest research by biologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians, tonight's guest shows how the post-Columbian network of ecological and economic exchange fostered the rise of Europe, devastated imperial China, convulsed Africa, and for 2 centuries made Mexico City, where Asia, Europe, and the new frontier of the Americas dynamically interacted, the center of the world. Please join me in welcoming to Darien Library, Mr. Charles C. Mann.
Maybe this isn't on. Is the microphone on?
I'll make sure.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Okay.
I'm probably too quiet.
Can you see this picture? And should they lower the lights? Yes? Is that something that you can do, Aaron? What's the, oh. To keep the night out? Yeah. Is that better? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you very much for coming. As I know from coming here myself, the weather's really awful. And it's very generous of you to come through the rain to hear me. So thank you. I thought I'd start at the beginning. As many of you probably learned in school, 200 million years ago or so, the world consisted of a single giant landmass. Scientists call it Pangea. Geological forces broke it up very slowly over tens of millions of years, creating the landmasses that we know today, forever separating the eastern and western hemisphere, and forever separating the creatures that lived on those hemispheres. And as a result, over tens of millions of years, they evolved completely different suites of plants and animals, ecosystems that didn't come into contact until suddenly, bang, they're brought together by this guy. Now, one of the ways I got started on this was that about 20 years ago, my mother demanded that I come back to my childhood home and deal with all the stuff that I had left there since I'd gone to college. There's a kind of knowing laugh from people and parents in the audience. There's sort of, I guess, 2 types of Americans, those who have gone through this as parents and those who have gone through this only as children. And so I went there and I looked through all this pile, and I was chagrined to discover my 8th grade American US history textbook from Highland Junior High School there. And I, of course, blew it off the dust, and I opened it up, and there was this picture right close to the front. And it was like, well, Columbus. And I stared at it, kind of riveted, because I had realized that from a modern perspective, there's quite a few things wrong with this picture, and not just the fact that everybody in it looks like George Washington. Because from a modern perspective, the reason that Columbus is important is that his voyages, and the voyages of the people that followed him, effectively recreated Pangea. They brought together the continents, they reunified the world. And as a result, huge numbers of creatures from over there came over here, huge numbers of creatures from over here came over there. And so this picture really should look something like this, with all the different species that came across with Columbus and the people who followed him. And this enormous convulsion this movement of species was called the Columbian exchange by the wonderful historian Alfred Crosby. And it was... She's trying to highlight how important it is by... And this Columbian exchange was the biggest event in the history of life since the death of the dinosaurs. And it played a huge role, it's kind of like a light show, it played a huge role in human history as well. And one way to think about it is illustrated here. This is a Dutch genre painting, and what it shows is a bunch of lower middle class people living in their barn. And this is the way that countless numbers of people in Europe, in Asia, and Africa lived for thousands of years, surrounded by their animals. And the reason that this is important in this context is that every now and then, an animal disease, as scientists say, jumps the species barrier and becomes a human disease. And the example we've had recently is bird flu, which you may have heard of, in which a disease of poultry became a variety of human influenza. And most of the great killers in human history originated this way. They're called zoonotic diseases. And so if you're an epidemiologist, the picture looks something like this. And so the cow, bovine rinderpest, is the origin of measles, bovine tuberculosis. Poultry is where we get influenza and pertussis or whooping cough. Over there is a horse on the right, and that's from equine encephalitis, which of course has gotten in the news recently, and probably smallpox, although some people think actually they came from camels. And then up in the rafters are the bats that are the origin of rabies. And so for thousands of years, Europeans, Asians, and Africans swam in a kind of bacterial and viral soup. That was the sort of way that they lived in this constant fog of bacteria, because they were constantly surrounded by these animals that were throwing off these germs and viruses. Now let's look at an equivalent house in the Americas. This is a replica of a Powhatan longhouse. The Powhatan were the most important people in Chesapeake Bay. They were the people that greeted John Smith, Pocahontas. That's the people we're talking about. And if you're an architect, this is basically the same house. It's a windowless structure. It's held together by these big poles that are lashed together. There's no chimney. There's no windows. It's basically the same structure. The big difference here is that all the animals are dead. It's like Sarah Palin's dream house, right? And, there's just this pile of animal corpses there. And the reason for this is that by a quirk of history, there are very, very few domesticable animals in the Americas at the time of Columbus. So there are no cattle, there are no horses, there are no sheep, there are no goats, there are no chickens. There are none of the familiar domestic animals, or no analogs of them. And so these people, Powhatan, didn't live around these animals. And as a result, they didn't live in this bacterial and viral soup. And hadn't. No native people had. They just basically did not have communicable diseases. And so there's a huge ecological imbalance between one side of the world and the other side of the world. And then so over here, on the right-hand side of the screen, are some of the diseases that came across the Atlantic in the first 150 or so years after Columbus. And over here on the left-hand side screen is a pretty complete list of the diseases that went the other way. And what you see is this bacterial onslaught, which of course the Europeans didn't know about because they didn't have a germ theory of disease, comes over. And in that first 150 or so years after Columbus, somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of the original inhabitants of the Americas die. It's as if all the suffering and death that these diseases have created over the thousands of years in Europe and Asia and Africa are compressed into a century and a half on this side of the Atlantic. And absent this tremendous devastation, it was the worst demographic collapse in human history. It's hard to understand how small groups of Europeans, poorly equipped, at the end of very long supply chains, could have established themselves in landscapes that are completely unfamiliar to them. Absent this tidal wave of disease, my ancestors very likely wouldn't have been here, and I dare say the same is true for some of yours as well. And so the first impact of the Columbian exchange is to make it possible for Europeans to come into the Americas. But it has even larger effects than that. One of the pleasures of working on this book is that a little bit of it appeared in National Geographic, and I got to work with this wonderful illustration and map staffs that they have there. And they contacted, and I did a little bit of work, enough to say I participated, but it was all theirs really, a whole bunch of archaeologists and anthropologists and historians who work on studying the east coast of the United States over time. And they asked them, what did the area that you study look like 500 years ago? And then they compiled the results into this kind of rough map. And the light areas are areas that native people had cleared for agriculture by burning. You know, they're open farm fields, like today's Midwest, cornfields for the majority. And then the dark areas are remaining forest. But even these forests aren't like the kind of forest we think, because native people burn the undergrowth once or twice a year to keep away bugs, which you guys know about in New England, right? They're kind of a bad deal. And if you burn the undergrowth, you kill a whole lot of them. And then the other reason is that it encouraged the kind of tender new growth that bring in the kind of deer that they like to eat. And so these forests were very open and park-like. They're so open and park-like that, you know, all the sort of initial descriptions by the Europeans who come over here are how you can, you know, drive a carriage through the forest. Or John Smith said that you could go at a full gallop through the deepest forest in Virginia, and he was crazy enough he may actually have done this. But so you have this open park-like forest, and then these fields. Now let's look, we asked these people the same question 150 years later in 1650. And what you see is all forest. And the reason is that the people who had been keeping it open had died. And the result was that there was a massive reforestation of the Americas. And this created the huge forest that people like Thoreau write about. You know, that this great forest primeval that we imagine to have been this timeless creation and have always been here in the Americas and then got burned down by Europeans actually was accidentally created by Europeans in the worst way possible. But it did more than that. If you think about it, when you see these trees coming in, what happens is people are no longer burning, so they're no longer sending carbon dioxide in the air, and the trees are growing, so they're taking carbon dioxide out of the air. And so then, in recent years, scientific journals have been filled with these kind of incomprehensible looking charts. Now, the point here is not to get you to understand this chart, it's very, but to try to convince you that there are these kind of charts. And what they are showing are efforts to measure what the carbon dioxide in the air was like 400, 500, 600, 700 years ago. And most of them show, the great majority show, that there's a big dip about 500 years ago. And this is the leading explanation, the leading sort of theoretical explanation for a phenomenon called the Little Ice Age, which was this 250-year-long cold snap that runs roughly between 1550 and 1800 and plunged most of the northern hemisphere into very long periods of winter, very short summers, and there's all kinds of things like the glaciers would come down from the Alps and push out French and Swiss villages, and the North Sea, parts of the North Sea froze over. It was very, very cold. And among the smaller impacts of it was the creation of another type of Dutch genre painting, the painting of little kids skating on the canals. And this is a famous painting of this from Peter Bruegel the Elder. I read an incredibly dull biography of him, hundreds and hundreds of pages long in my recollection. And I finally waded through it and found that this painting had been painted in late April and early May. And if any of you have been in the Netherlands, it's been a really, really long time since the Netherlands looked like this in late April. And the point of all this is that this is why this kind of crazy thing where Europeans come over, they bring their diseases over, it kills all these people, it causes change to the climate of the whole world, is why increasingly historians, scientists, ecologists of all sorts say that globalization really began 400 years ago, and that we've been living with it for 400 years ago. Columbus really marks the beginning of globalization, which we tend to think of as a modern phenomenon. Now, all this stuff that I've been telling you is a modern perspective. It's like today's perspective. My ancestors, your ancestors, none of them were aware of this, because this is, you know, something you learn now. What they were chiefly aware of, if they were European, is this. From their point of view, the big event that happened in all this was that in 1545, Spaniards discovered in southern Bolivia the biggest silver strike in history, in Potosi, as close to a mountain of pure silver as geology allows. It was a huge silver strike, just, you know, staggeringly large, biggest ever. And in the course of the next couple centuries, it effectively doubled or even tripled the world's supply of precious metals. This tremendous river of silver came out of southern Bolivia. And before this, Europe had been a relatively poor part of the world. And they were trying to get to China. I mean, that's why Columbus was sailing there, because they wanted to get to China. And the reason they wanted to get to China was that China was the richest most sophisticated, most technologically advanced nation in the world, and they wanted to go there. And the Chinese couldn't have been less interested. The main European industry at that point is textiles. The main textile was wool. And so there are these, it's in the records, the six Spanish and the Portuguese records, these people would finally make it to China, and they would attempt to trade a load of what is essentially scratchy 16th century bathrobes for silk. And you can imagine how well this went over. And they have these records. They don't want anything we make. From the Chinese point of view, it's like these hobos showing up and trying to sell them their rags. And the Chinese couldn't have, they were like, go away. Well, when they get the silver, things change. Because now the hobo's there, you still don't like him, but he's got a suitcase full of $100 bills. You're much more interested. And so this wash of silver comes, a huge chunk of it, the scholars argue whether it's half, 2/3, a third, whatever, goes to Spain's entrepot in Manila, where it's used to buy silk and porcelain and slaves and spices. It goes, then a bunch of that goes across Mexico, and sugar and tobacco goes to Spain, where it's used to buy guns and horses that buy slaves that you use to mine the silver. And so you have this loop of commerce that unites the entire world. At one point, my editor was talking about that we were going to call my book, "Ha Ha, Tom Friedman, the world has been flat for 400 years." But the marketing people, for some inexplicable reason, decided not to. But obviously, this is a tremendously important development. But even more important, I would argue, is this, that those ships were carrying across all these other hidden passengers that they weren't even really thinking about, often didn't know. And one of the most important is this one here, the potato. Potatoes originated in Peru, and in Peru, the Alps go, the Andes go bang up against the Pacific, and so in this very short distance, you go up, 22,000 feet, and you have every imaginable ecological niche packed into this very short area. And so over thousands of years, Peruvians have created thousands of varieties of potato that are suited for every one of these imaginable ecological niches. And they're so varied that the first time I went there, I went to this little village, and they had these for sale. And so I sailed up and I said, "What are those?" And they said, "Potatoes." And I said, "Come on, I speak a little bit of Spanish. I'm not a totally dumb gringo. What are they?" They said, "Potatoes." And it took a long time for me to realize I was, in fact, a completely dumb gringo, because they were all potatoes, and I just didn't even know what they were. Now, if you're a farmer, I recently actually gave a talk like this in New York City, and I realized I was showing this picture that a significant fraction of the audience had never seen, like, wheat. And so I had to kind of explain this, because I said, "You know what this is?" And there's all these people going, But you guys are much more sophisticated, I think, and you recognize wheat, right? And so wheat, if you think about it, the good part of wheat, the part you eat, is the stuff on top, right? The seeds there on top. And if you're an exceptionally good wheat farmer, you have big, plump, fat, heavy seeds, and there's this skinny stalk. And so if you're a very successful wheat farmer, the thing becomes top heavy, and the plant falls over. It's called lodging, and it kills the plant. And so there's a natural limit to how much you can grow in wheat, set by the architecture of the structure of the plant. Now over on the right, we have, as I hope you recognize, a potato with a very happy Lebanese potato farmer there. And this is not photographic trickery. This thing is actually bigger than his head. It's a 25-pound potato. And the reason that you can grow a 25-pound potato is because it grows underground. And it can just get as big as it wants to without, and the top part of the plant isn't going to be bothered at all. It's a much better architecture, much better structure for a plant that you want to harvest. And so when the potato comes to Europe, what it represents is a vastly superior type of food production. And the average 18th century farmer in a place like England, there's sort of studies on this, gets roughly 4 times as much what they call dry food matter, taking out the water, from an acre of potatoes than they do from an acre of wheat or barley or whatever cereal that they've been growing beforehand. And the results are huge. People recognize this, and potato spreads like wildfire. Now in the Andes, in the flat parts of the Andes, this is the way they grow potatoes. There are these things these are ridges and furrows. They're called huachacuna or huachos in Spanish. And they look like this. They cover thousands of acres. And the reason that they do this, you can see here. There's, you know, it's up there, it's 11,000 feet or so, it's cold a lot, and it snows. And if you look, the tops of the furrows have much less, the ridges have much less snow on them than the furrows. And the reason is that there's as much as a 7-degree difference in temperature between the top and the bottom. Just this creates a gradient, and it melts on the top, and then the stuff pools down in the bottom. So it's drier and warmer up top than it is down below, and this turns out to be this terrific means of preventing fungal diseases, because all the moist, cool areas that the fungal diseases like to grow in are in the furrows where nothing is growing, and then these are grown up on the top. It's a naturally clever way of doing it, and this, without any knowledge, is adopted by Europeans. And so for a couple of hundred years, Europe is covered with these ridges and furrows, and the landscape is, as one geographer put it, Andeanized. Much of northern Europe is transformed into something that a 12th century Incan peasant would have recognized. The Europeans take over, and there's this outfit called IASA, which is a think tank that I occasionally have some contact with, and they made me this map, and this shows the areas in which you can grow potatoes, sort of the optimum potatoes. You notice that the Andes aren't actually a particularly good potato growing area, but over there, look at Europe. I mean, and imagine that whole area is covered with potatoes. Europe is essentially transformed, northern Europe is essentially transformed from Ukraine to Ireland in a giant potato farm. Now the impacts are huge because they have all this new food. If you read, the great French historian Fernand Braudel is the first really to point this out in a consistent way. But the dotted line there is, he did a tally of all the sort of continent-wide European famines per century. And then what you see is that there's quite a few of them. And then the potato comes, that's the blue area, the American crops, potato, and then maize or corn in the southern part of Europe. And Europe starts being able to feed itself. Famines basically end. And if you read like a Daniel Defoe novel or anything like that, there's constantly mobs of unemployed. The mob is always spelled M-O-B-B, and there's hungry people and famines and armed men around granaries and this kind of thing. All that stops because of the potato. Europe, for the first time in its history, can really feed itself. And the result is European governments get a lot more stable, because it's obviously easier to govern a country that isn't convulsed with famine riots and bread riots and this kind of thing. The other thing that happens is that the population booms. Europeans stop dying of famine. And so what happens typically when a government becomes stable and starts feeling strong, what it likes to do is look around for some other place to conquer. And so they start having their empires, and then they got all these people that they can send off and conquer other countries with. And so this is the foundation, as Braudel put it, the potato is the fuel that makes these European empires possible. And it's so important, is the potato, to the development of Europe, that I would suggest that if you happen to go into this wonderful library here and inspired by my talk, you want to say, gee, I should learn more about European history, you should pull out the book, look in the index, and if there isn't an entry for potatoes, you should really get another book, because it's a very, very big deal. A couple years ago, some economists tried to quantify this, and they concluded that the potato had as much impact to Europe as the invention of the steam engine. I mean, it was a transformative thing. But that's doesn't exhaust its importance. The potato transformed European agriculture right in front of people's eyes, and so scientists said, wow, we could do more. And a German guy named Liebig figured out that plants depend on nitrogen to grow, and that the nitrogen in the air they can't use because it's in a form that it's not what's called bioavailable. You have to get it into other forms, nitrates and so forth, like ammonium. And one of the best areas to get one of the best ways to get it is from bird excrement, guano. It's a great natural fertilizer. And it turns out that these islands off the coast of Peru, the Chincha Islands, are the Fort Knox of guano. Seabirds have been roosting on these things for thousands and thousands of years, and so what you're looking at, they're very low islands. What you're looking at are gigantic cliffs of solid guano, 200 feet deep of guano. And they smell. I went there. It smells just as good as you think. There's never going to be a tourism industry there, but it's tremendously valuable because it's fertilizer. And so what they get a few thousand Chinese slaves, and they have these guano mines, just horrible, in horrible conditions, and they send the guano through the guano lines down these chutes into ships, and it all goes around the Cape of Good Horn and into Europe, bringing fertilizer and bringing the invention of sort of modern methods of agriculture. And so if you're a good 19th century farmer, you buy this stuff here, soluble Pacific guano. This is a sign that you're a modern guy. You're getting high yields. You're a highliner. It's great stuff. It secures to the farmer a large and remunerative crop, and this is actually true. It's true. It's the first high intensity fertilizer. But these guano ships carry another passenger, unknown to them, Phytophthora infestans, the potato late blight. And it does this to potatoes. If any of you grow tomatoes in your garden, and they have those big black spots on them, that's what it is. They're related. Potatoes and tomatoes are related. It's the same thing. And it's a disease that really, really likes to eat potatoes. And the records of where it arrived and what it did are quite good, actually, because Europe was so dependent on the potato. The Europeans were really noticed when potatoes started dying. And so in June of 1845, it shows up in this town, which I think is called Kortrijk. And you can see it radiating out mid-July, mid-August, mid-September, mid-October. Just blows across this huge area. And 1 million people die. Next year, next couple years, another 1 million people die. So probably 2 million altogether. The worst hit is Ireland. Ireland is the poorest part of Western Europe, and it's so dependent on the potato that the British actually have parliamentary inquiries about it, because it's weird from their point of view. And they discovered that the average Irish working man in 1830, I think the date is, eats 12 pounds of potatoes a day. And 40% of the population eats no solid food other than potatoes. Their diet consists exclusively of potatoes and milk, which weirdly enough is actually a pretty balanced diet. I mean, if you only have 2 things to eat, you should have potatoes and milk. It's pretty good. It's not like tasty, but it's what you'd want. And so what happens is that 40% of the Irish in a matter of weeks see their entire food supply vanish. And the results are horrifying. This is the Irish potato famine. It's the last major famine before the invention, the widespread dissemination of photography, so we don't have any photographs of it, but you can get some idea of what it looks like from these engravings that appear in English newspapers. All Irish newspapers completely collapsed. I mean, there's no Irish records like this of it because the entire Irish economy had turned in a stroke into this sort of post-apocalyptic landscape. It was horrifying. And again, it illustrates these kind of large-scale ecological changes that occur from globalization, this whole set of crazy things that was set off by Columbus. Now, actually I should mention something here. Ireland was so badly hit by this that even today, Ireland has fewer people than it did in 1845. It's probably the only nation in the world that is like that. It has fewer people within the same boundaries than it did 150 years ago. That's how badly it was hit by this kind of ecological sloshing around that was set off by Columbus. But it wasn't just Europe that was affected. China was also. Now, one of the problems of being a graduate of Highland Junior High School, like I was that we didn't learn anything about geography, nor did I in Interlake High School. And so as a result, I didn't know where anything really was, or never really looked at a map until I was in my 20s. And so in case some of you went to my kind of high school, this is China. And the thing is, if you look seriously at the map of China here, what you see is that in the entire western part of this big country, there's no water. It's all desert. And then even in the areas that do have water, there's no big bodies of water. There's no big lakes. There's no equivalent of our Great Lakes or anything like that. In fact, there's only 2 major rivers at all, the Huanghe, or the Yellow River up north, and then down south, the Yangtze. And then there's only 2, because so much of the country consists of all these dry hills, there's only 2 well-watered flat areas of the sort that you would normally think of would be good for agriculture. And those are the ones that I've sort of circled with those red lines. And so China really doesn't have, has 20% of the world's water, and 20% of the world's people, and 7% of the world's fresh water. And on top of that, the crop that everybody wants to eat has to be grown in swimming pools. It's a super water-intensive crop. And this is really insane. And one way to read Chinese history, emperor after emperor, dynasty after dynasty, is how do we feed people rice when we have no water and hardly any arable land? And they want rice. And it's they do amazingly well at it, but it's an incredible dance around these very, very unfavorable conditions. This dramatically changes in about 1600 when these American crops corn and sweet potatoes come and show up in China. And these are the first crops that you can get really significant amounts of food from in dryland areas that the Chinese have seen. They have cultivated a little bit in the drylands, but these largely, these areas that weren't well, were left to indigenous people. And what happens is, very much, just as Americans are pushing west, displacing indigenous people and then, planting their crops, the same thing happens in China. Under the Ming and the Qing dynasty, whole villages are picked up and told to go west, cut down all the trees, and start planting corn and sweet potatoes. And so if you go to northwest China, there's just an unbelievable number of areas that look like this, where people are farming what looks to me like a beach. And they're managing somehow to get corn out of this. It's unbelievable. I mean, these people are geniuses. I couldn't imagine getting what they're getting, but they're getting actually enough to feed themselves. And the same thing happens in China. These crops come and the population zooms up. And this is when China kind of becomes a watchword for overpopulation, with the tremendous influx of American of calories caused by American crops. And the way it works is, goes right into the 20th century. That's why you see pictures like this in the Mao dynasty, is they start shoveling people to the west, and they say these hills are very steep, so cut them into terraces. And here is this whole area that I went to in the northwest was, had been cut up in the 40s and 50s into these amazing terraces. And so you have this wedding cake effect. It goes for hundreds and hundreds of miles in northwest and southwest China. It's amazing. And you can go there, if you go there as a tourist, the buses will tell you about how this is our traditional way, and we've been planting things like this for hundreds of years. It's complete nonsense. This is all brand new stuff. It's a brand new adaptation to the arrival of crops. This whole thing was set up by Christopher Columbus. And so it's really quite astounding looking. And if you stay in these villages, what happens is, it sometimes rains, and when it does, you get woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning with this sound, because the entire village is out there with hand tools patting back these terraces, like this. Now, I hope if you look at this, you think, well, that isn't going to work very well, from your own experience with sandcastles and that kind of thing. And sure enough, this is a 90-year-old terrace. This poor guy is still trying to grow sweet potatoes on it. That's a sweet potato farm right there. And what's happened is, over time, his terraces have gone downhill. Gravitation operates and it pushes it downhill. And then what happens is there's a little trickle of water at the bottom of this ravine, and it carries the dirt down into another little slightly bigger trickle, which carries into another bigger creek, and then into a river, and then finally into the Yellow River, Huanghe. And so this area here is all slowly getting transported down the river towards the Pacific Ocean. I should say there's something that happens in rivers. There's a kind of physics of rivers. When the rivers are going through these steep hills, they're turbulent, and all the sediment in them stays churned up. It's like it's in a blender. It stays churned up. But when they go into these flat areas, remember those 2 circles that I drew, the river gets flat, it slows down, and it stops being so turbulent, and then the sediment deposits on the bottom of the riverbed. And because there's this absolutely amazing amounts of it, the riverbeds rather quickly builds up. It gets higher. And you have this bizarre phenomenon where the bottom of the river starts getting higher than the surrounding land. And there are actually places in China where the Yellow River is 30 or 40 feet above the surrounding land. And you don't have to have a physics PhD to realize that having a giant river 30 feet in the air isn't a stable situation. And what you start having is massive floods, huge floods. And one of the pleasures of working on this book, one of the more interesting parts, is I got to go in Beijing to the Chinese State Meteorological Bureau, where these guys have used for hundreds and hundreds of years, every county in China has had to compile an annual report of what happened in that particular county and send it to the court. And they have all these records, and they use them to compile these flood maps of China for the past 600 odd years. And if you see them, they're these big maps, and if you could flip through them, it's like a flip book of disaster. Now these are hard to read because, of course, these are Chinese, so I've doctored up this one. This is randomly chosen year. And the dark areas there are like Katrina-level floods, where they had them in this year. These huge areas that were, completely devastated, thousands of people killed, lots and lots of refugees, total wipeout. Now the bands there, in between them, is where they had floods like we had in Vermont a couple years ago, where there's lots of people lost their homes and their houses, but you weren't dealing with, total wide-scale devastation. So that's what happened here. And you can only imagine the cumulative impact of this happening year after year after year after year, fueled by this erosion in the West. And then when I asked one of the meteorologists there, well, how should I explain this to Americans, because it's so far from our own experience, he said to me, well, look, think of it, tell them it was like having a Katrina per month for 100 years. Now, as you may recall, just having one Katrina wasn't a very good thing for the administration of President Bush. People got mad at the government, and they said, what's going on? And they had to fire people, and it was thought to be a big black eye. Well, you can imagine what this was like for the Qing dynasty, having this happen again and again and again and again. Millions and millions of refugees. Some of the flood refugees from the southeast start something called the Taiping Rebellion. 20 million people die. The whole place is just a total catastrophe. And it's easy at this point for when China, just a few hundred years before this, had been the world's richest, most powerful, most technologically sophisticated nation. By the time we get to here, small numbers of Europeans are able to march in and throw their weight around. And this is all set off by this, sort of chain of events begun by Christopher Columbus. Now, even today, you see the impacts of this. If you go to northwest China, they've realized they've got to reforest these areas that have been cleared and devastated. And so they have these programs where they take entire villages and they say, okay, now you guys have finished farming, for the day, you've got your finished harvesting your plants, go out and plant trees. And the farmers aren't compensated for this. They don't like doing it. They get mad. And so what they've discovered is that the big part of the work is digging out these pits. And so it's much easier for them. They don't have to keep digging the pits. So what they do is they plant northern pine in this area. The trees die every year. And these farmers proudly told me as I was reading that some of these pits have been planted 6 and 7 times. So this gives you some idea of the limitations of autocracy. If people aren't invested in these things, they're not going to do it. So this is one of these large-scale environmental catastrophes that has not been fixed. Now, the Americas also were affected by this, our own country, our own history. And the biggest gift, I would argue, Columbus gave to the Americas was malaria. Malaria didn't exist in the Americas before Columbus. And in case any of you went to Highland Junior High School where we didn't study malaria, it's a tremendously important disease in human history. It's caused by a single-celled parasite, which is the little green guys in there, called Plasmodium, which is just this extraordinarily clever beastie. It's originally from a mosquito. The Anopheles mosquito is a kind of a genus of mosquitoes. The mosquito bites you. These little single-celled creatures are in its saliva, and it goes into your body, goes through a bunch of changes, multiplies, and they pry open red blood cells, slip inside the red blood cells where your immune system can't find, multiply crazy inside the red blood cells, and then in a coordinated assault, they rip open the blood cells and pour out into your body, billions strong, and you feel awful. With your body's suddenly been catastrophically invaded, and while you're sitting there prone and unable to do anything about it, another mosquito bites you, and there's so many in your blood of these guys in your blood supply that even though the mosquito is only taking a few drops of your blood, some of them get into the mosquito where they go through a bunch of changes and then they go and bite somebody else. And this is the way malaria works. It's a very clever beastie, as I mentioned. You can actually, after you get it, you can actually not be cured. It can be hiding in a dormant form in your spleen, and then you can say, go across the Atlantic and start, colonizing some part of the United States, and bang, you're hit with malaria again, and there are Anopheles mosquitoes here that are just waiting to get it. And so this is a map. The green areas show where there's Native American species of Anopheles. And these are the areas in which you can get malaria, which is, i.e., most of the Americas for this. Now, the worst kind of malaria is the kind that you always hear about Bill Gates trying to cure, and 750,000 kids under the age of 5 die in Africa every year. The really horrible kind of malaria is falciparum malaria. There's 200 different types of malaria. There's only 3 or 4 that really have an impact on people, and this is by far the worst. And falciparum malaria, which is this very deadly kind, is a tropical creature. It lives in Africa, and it likes warm weather. And so it effectively needs to do all the things it does inside the mosquito. It needs 3 weeks in which the temperature never goes below 67, 68 degrees once. And of course, that doesn't happen very often in a place like Connecticut. The temperature usually drops. And so what happens is It's a single-cell creature. When the temperature gets low, it slows down. It goes into slow motion. And if the temperature is low enough, it can't do all the things it needs to do before the mosquito dies. The mosquito's effective lifespan is like 2 or 3 weeks. And so it's kind of a race against time for the point of view of so there's a climatic difference. When it's too cold, it really just can't thrive here. And that red line is roughly where Plasmodium falciparum can survive below it. And above it, it can't. And if you notice, that's the Mason-Dixon line. It's pretty much exactly the Mason-Dixon line. If you go to Washington, D.C., records are full of malaria. Go up to southern New Jersey, very southern tip of New Jersey, almost never. There's a big band there where you just don't, where there's malaria and not malaria. The same thing is true in the south. Brazil, tons of malaria. Argentina, Uruguay, not so much. And I think, as you notice, between those red bands is the areas in which slavery really thrived in the Americas. I live in Massachusetts. Massachusetts was the first state to legalize slavery, so there was slavery in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Rhode Island, around here. But we didn't have slave societies the way they did in Virginia or the Carolinas or Georgia. It was quite different. Slavery existed, but But Massachusetts was not a slave society. Same thing is true in South America. Argentina had lots of slaves, but it was not a slave society the way that Brazil was. And I'm going to argue that this map is no coincidence. And I'm going to show you another map here. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of maps. I hope you like them. I like maps, but not everybody else does. Malaria has been around for so long that human bodies, in areas with lots of it, have adapted to it. And most of the adaptations consist, in one way or another, of changing the red blood cells slightly to make it harder for the little creature to get in there and pry it open. And so sickle cell anemia is the most famous. It's very complicated, but the basic way, maybe you can summarize it in a very simple way by saying that it sort of makes you half immune to society, half immune to falciparum malaria. But if you see, that red area shows you that's where people have sickle cell anemia. That's where it's prevalent. People in Central and West Africa have more of this kind of protection than any place else in the world. There's another kind of change, it's called G6PD deficiency, also, again, in Central and West Africa. This has a weird side effect that if you really have a super strong case of G6PD deficiency, you become deadly allergic to fava beans. And when I lived in Rome a little bit, and there's a certain number of people in Sicily who have this deficiency, and their kids would come over to the United States, and they'd go back to the old homeland, and Uncle Giorgio would serve them a big platter of fava beans. They'd take a bite and drop dead. And this would happen, every 6 months or so to some luckless American tourist. But so the main thing, though, is that this kind of deficiency is, again, in Central and West Africa. There's more people with this change in their red blood cells than any other place in the world. There's another type of malaria, the second most important type, which is called vivax malaria. There's another change to the red blood cell called the Duffy negative antigen that gives you total protection from vivax malaria. And if you'll see, Central and West Africa, so many people have the Duffy negative antigen that it's the only tropical place in the world where there is no vivax malaria. They're completely immune to it. It just doesn't exist over there because people have successfully adapted to it genetically. Now, malaria had a companion, a disease that was always around with it, yellow fever, which is also transmitted by mosquitoes. Another type of mosquito is Aedes aegypti. And that was originally confined to Central and Western Africa. It's a disease of Central and Western Africa, but it rapidly spread. All the dark areas are where yellow fever was by the 19th century. Now, yellow fever is like chickenpox. If you get chickenpox when you're a kid, you feel sick for a while, but then you recover. If you get it as an adult, it's serious business, and you have a chance of dying. Yellow fever, it's about 75% mortality rate for adults and practically nothing for kids. So because everybody in Central and West Africa had it as children, that was the world center for people who were immune to yellow fever as well, adults who were immune to it. So all these people in Central and West Africa don't get yellow fever and don't get malaria. The difference is really striking. When Europeans tried to conquer Africa, so many of British, and particularly British, died doing it from malaria and yellow fever that they had the same kind of parliamentary inquiries that are there. And a wonderful historian, Philip Curtin, unearthed these and sort of examined the data And what he found was that in places like Sierra Leone and Cape Coast, if you were a British soldier, if you had 1,000 British soldiers in Sierra Leone, 483 of them would die every year. So there's a 48% chance of dying of yellow fever or malaria in Sierra Leone every year. Same thing in Cape Coast, only even higher, which is Cape Coast is also in West Africa. 668 out of every 1,000 die every year. So you have between a half and 2/3% chance of dying every year if you're a European in these areas. Now over on the right-hand side, they had native people, who were working for the British. The British treated them badly, but you look at the death rates in West Africa, 32 per thousand. There's 10 times more likely to die of malaria and yellow fever if you're in Africa, if you're a European, than if you're an African. And when malaria and yellow fever came to the Americas, the same thing held true. And this relates to a question that Adam Smith asked. Adam Smith, the great economist, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. If you read The Wealth of Nations, this terrific book, 3 or 4 times he wrestles with the issue of why there is slavery. So Adam Smith couldn't understand. He hated slavery, and he couldn't understand why it existed. He pointed out that there's this institution called indentured servitude. And indentured servitude is the way that huge numbers of Europeans initially came over to the United States. The way it works is, you're a person who wants to start a tobacco plantation in the Chesapeake Bay. You need labor. So you go and find a poor person in England, and you pay for that person's passage, which is expensive. And then that person works off the cost of their passage for 4 to 7 years, and then they're free to go off and start their own plantation. And this institution had worked very well in Europe for a really long time. And in fact, in the 17th century, 2/3 of the people who came to the United States were indentured servants. Suddenly, though, in the 1680s, it changes, and you have slaves. There's a big changeover. Indentured servants drop down, slavery booms. And Smith couldn't understand this. Look, he said, I'm using obviously modern language, but what he said is, look, these people don't even speak English, right? They speak some African language. They don't know how to farm wheat or tobacco or whatever it is that you want to farm, because they're from a tropical country. They eat palm stuff. They don't know how to do anything you want them to do, so you have to teach them. And the third thing is, most important, they really, really don't want to work for you. I mean, why would they? They're slaves. You've taken their liberty. You've deprived them of their family. You treat them abominably. Why are they going to work for you? Whereas these people have a reason. They expect that there's an exit route. They think, okay, this is a deal I've worked into, and I'll fulfill my part. You fulfill your part, and it's fine. It's a contract. So Smith said, why would you have slaves when you could have indentured servants? And he never understands it. He wrestles with this 3 or 4 places in the Wealth of Nations, and finally he sort of waves his hand and says slavery exists because people are wicked. Which is true. People are wicked, but still, it's pretty weird. And I'm going to argue that what Smith did not know was that malaria was there. And that malaria means that your indentured servant's going to come over here and have somewhere, between a 40 and 70% chance of dying. A total loss for you. Whereas the slave is much more likely to survive. 3 or 4 times more likely to survive, even given the terrible conditions that they're brought over. And the difference is so enormous that there's this massive changeover, and these great parts of America became slave societies. And this huge stain on American history, this one that everybody is still dealing with, arises in part because of the accidental importation of malaria and yellow fever. And this has an impact on not only just here, but on the entire human race. The both malaria and the Columbian exchange. Because our own species is involved. If you think about it, in 1492, basically every European was in Europe. Every African was in Africa. Every person from East Asia, China and Japan, was in East Asia. Every Native American was in the Americas. After Columbus, it's like our own species, Homo sapiens, has been put into a blender. And you have these crazy things like Australia, dominated by Europeans. Argentina, dominated by Europeans. These really weird, remote places. You have Brazil, dominated by Africans. You have Chinatowns all over the globe. It's like somebody's juggled and then dropped all the balls, and our species is this random assortment. But the biggest movement of all, in all of this crazy exchange of us, is the movement, this huge wash of Africans across the Atlantic. So much so that, according to David Eltis, in this massive project to sort of quantify the slave trade, said that by as late as the 19th century, nearly 4 Africans had come across the Atlantic for every European. And so when we think of our own history, the history of the United States, the history of the Americas after Columbus, what you're really seeing, certainly for the initial few centuries, is not so much Europeans sailing off into a wilderness, but a wilderness being created and the collision of 2 populations, the diminished remnants of Native Americans and this huge wash of Africans. And all these colonial societies, with a few small exceptions, are dominated by this dynamic. And this is really what, if you're standing back, what our American history really looks like. And that's really what I came to talk to you about tonight. And thank you very much for listening to me. I'd be happy to have questions, but you also can run away if you're, worried.
So the obvious question is, what is your next book about?
Oh, I don't really have like an elevator description about it. So oh, I hate that question. It's sort of it's a book about the future that makes no predictions. That's as elliptical as an answer I can give you that's actually true. Okay.
What was the native population in North and South America separately before Columbus?
Well, this turns out to be this huge area of argument about historians, because obviously nobody counted, right? And I think the way I would put it is this way. When I went to school, they said there were roughly like 8 million native people in all of the Americas, and 900,000, when I went to school, and 900,000 in North America, where we live. And today nobody believes that, but there's not quite sure. And the typical estimates for the total population are 40 to 60 million, though that number keeps rising. And estimates for the U.S., sort of North America, hardly anybody was in Canada, is 10 to 15 million, though also that number keeps rising. So I wouldn't be surprised if at the end it shook out at 60 to 80 million and maybe 20 million. But that's just a personal guess. But the answer is that this is a big active area of argument and dispute.
How did they come up with that chart that showed where the clear land was and where the woodland was in 1492?
The one at the very beginning?
Satellite imaging or something?
Well, there's a whole bunch of techniques. I mean, there's a lot of archaeological techniques, and what you can do is if you have a little lake or something, you can take a sample of the bottom, and if it hasn't been disturbed, and you can measure the types of pollen in there, and the pollen actually is oddly enduring stuff, and so what they'll typically find is lots and lots of corn pollen, and then in 1500, bang, it stops. And then there's a short grass pollen, and then trees. And then, so you find that kind of record. There's a whole bunch of different ways they study, but that's a big one.
We had potatoes, we had malaria, and we had people shifting around, causing all these great changes. Well, what's the corollary for today? We have similar to that, is it information?
Well, we have, there's a bunch of things. We have things like, I live in Western Massachusetts, and I just received today an emergency alert on this listserv in part because the emerald ash borer from China is just showed up and is going to eat up all the forests in Western Massachusetts. So there's a huge number of these kind of imported bugs, insects, that are eating American forests. They're a big, big problem in the West. So that would be an example of these things that are, right here today. They come in the shipping pallets, and there's a big argument about whether they should really have the kind of shipping pallets they have, or should they be X-rayed to kill the insects, and this kind of thing. Something that I think is going to happen in the future is if you go to Southeast Asia, 40-some% of the rubber that is used to make belts and tires and all the things in your car and in many other places it still comes from trees, because it has properties that synthetic rubber, it's really, really expensive to get those properties from synthetic rubber, and it's cheaper to just grow a bunch of trees. And so an area about the size of Great Britain in Southeast Asia is covered with this single type of tree from Brazil, Hevea brasiliensis, and that's where our tires come from. And there's a blight. The reason that they don't have it in Brazil is that there's a blight there called South American leaf blight that really, really likes rubber trees, and that's why there's no rubber plantations in Brazil. All the trees are sort of scattered, hundreds of yards away from each other in the forest. And sooner or later, somebody from Brazil is going to fly over with mud on his shoes, and there's going to be a real catastrophe. So these things are, unfortunately, still happening. Yeah, people. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, when I went down to southern Mexico not that long ago, one of the big constraints, this is an area where maize originated, and so they have many, many types of maize. It's kind of like the potatoes. They see all these different kinds of corn, and people are very proud of their kinds of corn. And then they're discovering that it's being mixed with genetically modified corn that comes from the States. And there's great consternation because of this. And so then this is when plant breeders then try to breed types of corn that is immune to this disease or that disease, they always go to the types of corn they have in southern Mexico. It's so many different, there's like a huge amount of genetic diversity there. And so there's this fear that all of this will now effectively become modern GMO type corn. So that would be an example of exactly what you're talking about. And nobody really knows what the consequences are. I mean, maybe they'll be good. Gold? It was interesting because what happened is the Spaniards were initially looking for gold because that was what Europeans really liked, and they found it, but they found so much more silver that in the long run the silver was what really made things happen. And I talked about in the other book in the context that the Spaniards are always called gold and silver crazy, greedy for gold and so forth, and they were. But if you think about it, they had these very long trips that they had to make, and they had these ships that weren't that large. So they to justify the enormous expense, they had to find something that they could carry back on the ships that was worth the expense and that wouldn't perish. So that and so you have gold. It's like ideal. It's this thing that's not very large, and it can get really wet, and it doesn't get moldy or anything like that. So they're completely focused on it. In addition to this, but even though they're focused on the gold, what really ended up, playing the big role was the silver. Thanks.
Why is there such no trace of these original native peoples, particularly in North America?
Well, actually, there's quite a lot of traces for them. I mean, it's always thought that but actually, for example, at the time of Columbus, there was the biggest sort of type of society in North America, in our country, was the Mississippian cultures. And there's thought to have been about 10,000 Mississippian cities, and they're centered on these large earthen mounds, which are all in the southeast and then go all the way up the Mississippi Valley, and then some of them are in the shapes of animals and things that are really pretty cool. And there's a place called Cahokia near St. Louis that is really worth seeing, where they have one of the largest pyramids in the world is right there, 10 miles away from St. Louis. And most of these places weren't recognized by people over the next few centuries when the trees grew over them. And so only about 1,000 of these mound cities remain. But they're all over the place. And then the same thing in the Southwest. They have these big networks of irrigation that have permanently changed the hydrology of the Southwest. And it's now, I think, generally acknowledged that one of the reasons that so many of the southwestern cities have problems with their water supplies is that they are sort of contending with these patterns that were set by pre-Columbian peoples that that they didn't know about, and so they moved in ignorance, and they're being but there's all this stuff that was done before that. And in the Northwest, where I'm from, there is increasing evidence that the types of plants that grow in these forest areas are the remnants of these complicated kinds of forest gardens. There's a guy named Dewar who's the main. So there's lots more stuff than we recognize. It's just often that the kinds of technology they use is so different from what we're expecting that it's not big structures of stone. In Florida, all along the Gulf Coast, there are these gigantic canals that they're now discovering, and which have been filled in over time, and these big pile. They had these kind of aggregate cities made of this kind of aggregate made out of billions or zillions and zillions of smashed together clamshells, and that were made this very loose cement kind of stuff that water could go right through, and so they built up high, and so when they had these high tides from the hurricanes and so forth, it just washed right through the structure. It's really interesting. There's a guy at the University of Florida I know who's trying to see if this can be adapted for today's hurricane housing, and so people would say, oh yeah, there's piles of shells there, but it actually there's much more than that. So the answer is they left lots of traces, but often we have in the past not been able to recognize what they were. Sorry for such a long-winded answer. I kind of think it's, there's like this imbalance there, and it's really hard to, I asked a couple of epidemiologists, could they imagine it not happening? And they, like the whole hemisphere being put in some kind of quarantine. I mean, it's sort of hard to imagine how that would work. And then, the weird thing is that Columbus was this odd guy who had these crazy ideas. The way the Americas should have been discovered by any sort of natural way was that to go around Africa, which is what the Portuguese were doing, the currents right close to West Africa are the wrong way. They go north. And so they would swing out, way out, into the Atlantic to go around them. And in 1500, a guy named Cabral went too far, and he bumped into Brazil. And that's the way absent the craziness of Columbus, the Americas would have been discovered. That's like a completely natural way that doesn't involve Columbus's crazy ideas about the world being smaller than it actually is, and that sort of stuff. And so it would have happened, I think, that way, and it would have, and then these exchanges would have happened. It might have happened a lot later. There's sort of bad luck that these diseases came so quickly, but I think they would have come.
This summer, I went to Newfoundland, Canada, and there's a place, Viking.
Yeah, Lanso Meadows, yeah.
So how do you think this thing got back?
Oh, it's really cool. I mean, it's very definite that the Vikings were here. The interesting thing is they had no impact. They're thought to have been here, I think, about 20, 30 years, but it just didn't have any impact whatsoever. I mean, it wasn't like when the Pilgrims came that the guys were wearing those hats, right, with the horns, or eating lutefisk or anything, and that's often what you say. There's a lot of people who believe, for one reason or another, that many people, crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific before Columbus. And I think quite likely, but I also think that they unlikely to have had any impact. And what Columbus did is that started things with impact.
That's because in Europe they brought all the bacteria and viruses.
Right.
These Vikings from other parts of the world, or Chinese that traveled thousands of years ago with the oceans.
for a planner probably.
Well, but also when they did this, when the Vikings went, it was very much colder, and it's harder for these kind of diseases to be transmitted in really cold weather. They're much smaller in number, and then also the ships were very slow. And to have these diseases go across, there has to be somebody who has them, and they would have, if the ships are really slow, it burns out on the ship before getting it. The remarkable thing is the Spaniards came up with these very quick ships in those terms, and they could take off from the Canary Islands, and it's just sort of barely possible for smallpox to make it from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean if the winds are just favorable, and that's what happened in 1519. Mm-hmm. What?
Little incubators.
Yeah, and you need to have you know, a good-sized incubator that travels fast. Yeah.
You discussed climate change in the 250 years of intense cold. What do you see, you know, happening today with various patterns? See historical precedent for changes that are going on today, global warming?
Well, if this our argument is correct, it seems like, you know, we've been changing the climate for a long time, and so we shouldn't be so shocked that we can do this. And the interesting thing about the Little Ice Age is it caused huge problems in a very spotty way. Like there would be little warm periods, you know, in the middle of it. It wasn't like a uniform blanket. It was just that there was, you know, huge numbers of very, very cold winters. But that didn't mean there was never a warm one. If you know, it changed the overall pattern, and it also caused really lots of violent storms and things like that in places where they don't usually have them now. And so if what we're doing now is anything like this, it suggests that this kind of real unpredictable hot weather will come, you know, with lots of breaks and weird things like hurricanes coming into Massachusetts, which we had, you know, in the last year. We were building a house, my wife and me, and during the year of construction we had a hurricane and a typhoon, you know, a tornado in Springfield, and a tornado in Springfield, right? And we had a 6-inch rainfall, which nobody could ever remember having. So it seems like we're going to have these weird events more and more often, together with these, for me, rather unpleasant hot periods in the middle of the summer, which I didn't enjoy this summer particularly. But I'm not an expert on this. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.